Greetings, everyone. Chris Hislop from the Montana World Affairs Council. Welcome to another episode of Academic World Quest 2023 Preparation. In this series, we're looking at each of the 9 themes for Academic World Quest 2023 and talking with international experts to help our students who are preparing get even better prepared. So if you've missed any of our preparation series, of course, you can find those on our YouTube channel. Today, we've got another special treat from our partners at the U.S. Department of State. Before I introduce them, I want to go to our good friend Irina Karmanova to give us a brief video on the U.S. State Department. Over to you, Irina.
Hi, thank you so much for having us one last time. It's been a wonderful honor to have the State Department be participating in this program. And we thank our Montana World Affairs Council partners for this opportunity. My name is Irina. I work in the Office of Public Liaison at the State Department, where we connect with World Affairs Councils and high schools and colleges across the country. So stay in touch with us and find us at Engage State on Twitter. Before I turn it over to the main speakers for our presentation today, I'll share a quick video on the State Department and connect with us also on potential careers and internships. We're always happy to chat.
Wonderful and It's a wonderful and complex world out there, filled with challenges and opportunities. That's why America's diplomats with the U.S. Department of State are on the job every day, representing you. We are advancing America's foreign policy interests by uniting our allies, confronting our adversaries, and protecting our citizens. We advance democracy, human rights, global health, and more. We grow markets that create American jobs. We are America's first federal agency, and we're in 190 countries at over 270 U.S. embassies and consulates, serving you. We are the United States Department of State.
Thank you for watching, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thanks a lot, Irina, and a reminder to Montana students and any student around the nation who's watching this. In February, the Montana World Affairs Council will have our International Careers Week, where you can meet up with people from the U.S. State Department, the United Nations, the military, international education, you name it. So if you've got an interest in working in the world, come back and see us in February for that series. Now let me introduce our guests. Annie Arbuthnot is a Foreign Affairs Officer in the State Department's Office of Conservation and Water. Prior to joining the Department of State, Annie gained experience working in international conservation efforts at the World Wildlife Fund and the International Union for Conservation of Nature. A native of Washington, D.C., Annie is fluent in French, having spent her junior year of high school as an exchange student in Switzerland and later teaching in France. Annie's joined by Jarrad Scott. He's a member of the Wildlife Conservation and Combating Wildlife Trafficking team in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs at the U.S. Department of State. Whew, that's a mouthful, Jarrad. He covers a broad portfolio, including conservation and wildlife trafficking in Africa, tiger conservation and trafficking the use of protected species in traditional medicine, and the department's visa ineligibility program for wildlife and timber traffickers. Jarrad spent 3 years at the U.S. Embassy in Myanmar and also worked for the U.S.-based conservation NGO Wild Earth Allies. Originally from Australia, Jarrad was previously the Assistant Director for Environment and Sustainability at the Australian Department of Defence and the Sustainability Project Manager for the West Australian Police Department. Jarrad and Annie, welcome to the show. It's very nice to have you on. So we're very excited to hear more about this theme. It is something, of course, we hear a lot about in the news, but tend to know very little. So over to you to help us understand the situation.
Fantastic. Thanks for having us, Chris. I'm going to put up our slide presentation now. It's a pleasure to join you all this morning for our presentation. As Chris said, my name is Jarrad Scott. I work in the Office of Conservation and Water in the Bureau of Oceans and International Environmental and Scientific Affairs at the State Department. For those of you that don't know, the US Department of State advises the president and leads the nation in foreign policy. Our specific Office of Conservation and Water coordinates the development of US foreign policy approaches to conserving and sustainably managing the world's ecologically and economically important ecosystems, including forests, wetlands, drylands, and coral reefs, the species that depend on them, and the world's water resources. Nature provides the resources on which humans depend for our survival and for our economic growth. Our office is actually divided into 3 teams. We have a forest and genetic resources team, a water team, and we have a wildlife team. And Annie and myself are both on the wildlife team. So, what are some of the global challenges facing wildlife in the world today? These are probably the top 4 most challenges to wildlife on the planet at the moment. In habitat encroachment and loss, and these are through practices like industrial development, housing development, and particularly agricultural expansion into intact ecosystems. Invasive species, which are species that are introduced into an area that are not from that particular place, and that then have a harmful impact on the ecology of that particular area. Diseases and the spread of diseases between wildlife, domestic animals, and humans. Climate change, we all know, is in the news almost daily, and the increase in natural disasters, floods, droughts, storm events, and significant temperature changes globally have an impact on species. But the one we're going to talk about today is overexploitation and wildlife trafficking. That is the focus for our presentation today. That is the focus of the team that Annie and I both work within. So what is wildlife trafficking? Wildlife trafficking is the poaching or other illegal taking of protected or managed species and the illegal trade in wildlife and their related parts and products. But it's important to know that not all trade in wildlife is legal. There is a lot of legal trade in wildlife that takes place around the world. So what makes trade in wildlife illegal? It is illegal when it is done in contravention of local or international laws. For example, there's an international treaty that regulates trade in endangered species called the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or CITES. The US Fish and Wildlife Service is the US government lead on this particular convention. The legal trade in wildlife can make it very difficult to regulate, monitor, and combat the illegal trade. And that's because legal pathways are often used to launder illegal animals. The flip side of this would be something that is clearly illegal, like cocaine. If you came through the Great Falls International Airport with a suitcase full of cocaine, law enforcement would not be confused about whether it should be seized or not. Whereas if it was wildlife, it can be very specific about, dependent upon the species. There are many species of wildlife or animals that look very similar to one another, and some of those are protected and some are not. It's also important to know that wildlife trafficking focuses on the illegal trade, and it specifically covers the entire supply chain from source through transit to destination and consumption. And depending upon the country and even the species being traded, different laws can be activated. And the other thing to realize about the trade or the illegal trade in wildlife and wildlife trafficking is it is often a very, very cruel and gruesome practice. And you might see some images that may be a little bit uncomfortable in our presentation. So the scale of wildlife trafficking. Every year between $5 and $23 billion in illicit revenue is generated through wildlife trafficking. It involves hundreds of millions of species, including around 6,000 species of wild animals and over 32,000 species of wild plants that are protected under the CITES Convention. Over 100 million tons of fish, 1.5 million tons of million live birds, and 440,000 tons of medicinal plants are trafficked in just 1 year alone. 20,000 African elephants and about 1,000 rhinos are poached every year. And an estimated 6 million tons of bushmeat is taken from the Amazon and Congo basins alone every year. It's also really important to know that wildlife trafficking often converges with other forms of transnational organized crime like drug trafficking, weapon trafficking, human trafficking, and money laundering. And criminal networks have been established and criminal syndicates around the world to facilitate this illegal trade. And corruption plays a significant factor in this as well. And it really hinders our ability to break down these criminal networks. Corrupt actors exist at very high levels in government. They can be police officers, they can be high-ranking government officials, and often these corrupt actors get kickbacks and monetary gain from allowing the illicit trade in wildlife to occur. It's also important to realize that wildlife trafficking is a significant global problem. And this particular diagram shows wildlife trafficking seizures in air transport alone. This does not include marine and overland transport routes. And as you can see from this diagram, just about every single country and continent on Earth is affected by wildlife trafficking in some form or another. So what is the world's most trafficked mammal? For those of you that don't know, it is a little known animal called the pangolin, which are from a unique group of insect-eating animals, mammals. They mainly eat termites and ants. They're about the size of a cat, a house cat, and they're covered entirely in scales. There are 8 species of these that exist in the world, 4 in Africa and 4 in Asia, and they range from vulnerable to critically endangered on the IUCN Red List. One of the reasons why this is the most widely trafficked animal on the planet is because it's used very widely in traditional medicine practices, and we'll cover that in another slide coming up shortly. So what are the main drivers of wildlife trafficking? Why would anybody want to begin to trade illegally in wildlife? The next 4 slides, we're going to go into a little bit more detail and explore the top 4 drivers underlying wildlife trafficking. But before I do, I want to highlight that wildlife trafficking is often seen as a low-risk, high-reward business. That's because the risk of being caught and the penalties associated when you get caught are relatively low. But the value of the wildlife and the products when they're sold, i.e. the rewards, are very, very high. So sometimes people do this because they're greedy and they want to get wealth from it, and other people do it because out of a need, because they're poverty stricken. So the first driver I want to talk about is the illegal exotic pet trade. Thousands of different species are traded for the exotic pet trade every year, including animals like chimpanzees, slow loris, seahorses, snakes, turtles, birds, big cats, and even bears. And that's just the beginning of a very, very long list. Often these animals are illegally captured from the wild, and then they're bred in captivity for the sale of their offspring. So a person might buy an animal that was bred in captivity, but whose parents came from the wild illegally. And this particular trade is also illegal. So you have to be very careful. This is another reason why it's very difficult sometimes for us to regulate this particular trade. The demand countries are the Middle East. Significant amount of big cats, even elephants, believe it or not, are smuggled. I mean, who could imagine smuggling an elephant? But it happens into the Middle East for private zoos and for pet ownership. Asia, Europe, and even the USA are very large demand or destination countries for exotic pets. Many people in the USA have reptiles and birds that come from faraway countries in South America and even in Asia. And a lot of this trade happens online via social media and online platforms. And here's a fun fact. Between 1982 and 2001, 657,000 wild caught African grey parrots were traded as pets. They are one of the most traded bird species on the planet. And there's a picture of the little guy down there in the bottom corner. The next main driver of wildlife trafficking is traditional medicine. China is by far the largest consumer of wildlife products globally, many of which are used for traditional medicine. The practice of traditional medicine is a global practice, and it even happens in the USA. The difference being that in the USA, we have very strict laws that prevent the use of endangered and protected species, and those laws sadly don't necessarily exist in other countries. As a result of this demand, a number of industries have popped up across Asia and even in Africa to breed wildlife specifically for traditional medicine use. And we see in Africa, tiger farms and even pangolin farms are appearing. And pangolins are particularly interesting because they're really, really difficult to breed in captivity. In fact, to date, there are very, very few examples where pangolins have been bred successfully in captivity. So when you see a pangolin farm advertising its pangolins as being captive bred, pretty much we know that they are taken from the wild. And many of these farms also advocate that they're helping conservation efforts by breeding these animals. But in reality, they're actually just keeping the demand alive for endangered species, because in many cases, it's very, very difficult to reintroduce captive bred animals into the wild, particularly if they've spent a long period of time in captivity, because they lose their natural instincts and they become familiar with human beings, and that can be a real problem. Bear farms in Vietnam are another massive problem. Bears are used to harvest bear bile, and this practice is really horrific. They harvest bile from bears while they're still alive. They hook them up to tubes into their stomach, into their bile producing organs, and the animals are alive while they harvest bile from them for use in traditional medicine. Across Southeast Asia, there are approximately 300 captive tiger facilities with about 8,000 tigers. And this is a staggering figure because in the wild, there are only about 4,500 tigers that remain. So there's more tigers in captivity being farmed than there are in the wild, which is really sad. And unfortunately, many of the medicinal products that are made have unsubstantiated medical benefits. For example, the pangolin, which is harvested for its scales and used widely in traditional medicine because of its scales, it's used to promote things like arthritis and cancer cures, to promote breastfeeding in lactating mothers, to improve poor circulation. It's even used to enhance male virility. But the scales are made of keratin, and keratin is the same substance that our hair and our toenails are made up of. So in fact, it's actually better for you just to chew on your toe than it is to kill a pangolin. It's easier to do that. Another driver is decorative products, trophies, and status symbols. Much of the world's elephant, ivory, and rhino horn products end up in antiquities and galleries carved into intricate decorations like the tusk you can see in the top corner, which sells for tens of thousands of dollars. Trophy hunting is another challenging problem, but there's also a lot of legal gray area here. In many cases, the act of trophy hunting is actually legal and you can get permits to do it in some places. But what sometimes happens is that the legally obtained trophies, like the horns and the tusks and the teeth, are then sold illegally for a lot of money on the black market. And just recently, a Southeast Asian crime syndicate had been hiring sex workers to act as a front for hunters who were then issued permits to trophy hunt. And when they shot their rhinos, the horns were then sold as trophies, or the trophies, were then sold on the black market in Southeast Asia. And sadly, the women involved never had any real ownership of the trophies, and all the money went back into the syndicate. The red beads you see on the screen here are actually highly polished elephant skin, and they appear as luxury goods, as jewelry. Tigers' skins appear as fur coats and as floor coverings, and a lot of this links back to status. You know, these are given as gifts because they're a symbol of status. And every year, around 200,000 endangered animals are killed. And the final driver is bushmeat consumption and food consumption. We see a lot of bushmeat consumption in rural areas that is linked to food insecurity and poverty. But the real demand for illegal wildlife products in urban areas is not for subsistence, but rather as a delicacy for food and status symbol. And I just want to say, bushmeat is basically any wild animal that's harvested and eaten as food. We can't overstate the risk that the consumption of wild animals poses for the emergence and spread of zoonotic diseases. And we're going to talk about that in a little moment. But as you can see here, a lot of different animals across the world are consumed as exotic delicacies, but also out of sheer need and desperation. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Annie now, and she will continue with the presentation.
Thanks, Jarrad. So Jarrad talked about what wildlife trafficking is and went into some of its drivers. Now I'm going to look a little bit about the impacts of wildlife trafficking. So one impact is biodiversity loss. Wildlife trafficking pushes wildlife to the brink of extinction. Even for species that haven't gone fully extinct, there are species that we would consider functionally extinct, meaning they're not reproducing, they can't sustain themselves as a population, and really it's only a matter of time before they're completely gone. So one example of this is the northern white rhino. Rhinoceros. There used to be thousands of them, but then in the 1970s, the population had basically been reduced to hundreds due to poaching. And today, poaching has devastated the population so much that there are only 2 left in the wild, and they're both female. So clearly, you know, that's an example of something that we would consider a species being functionally extinct. Wildlife trafficking also undermines security and stability. It's a form of serious transnational organized crime. And just like other forms of transnational organized crime, you know, it leads to insecurity, instability. It robs governments and communities of legitimate economic opportunities as well. Things like tourism. There is so much tourism that is driven by people wanting to see and take pictures of these magnificent, charismatic megafauna, we sometimes call them, these really charismatic species in the wild. You know, I think some of the people I've seen with the best cameras in the world are birders who travel all over to see, you know, different kinds of exotic birds. And we can't forget that wildlife really play a key role in the functioning of ecosystems that they exist in. So ecosystems that provide services such as clean water, clean air, nutrient cycling, species also are involved in or are pollinators, you know, and they spread seeds, they're dispersers. These are all benefits that nature provides, and wildlife are really key to that. At the same time, we really cannot gloss over the devastating loss of life of people who stand up to protect wildlife from wildlife traffickers. Rangers that are just going out and doing their jobs every day. There are around 100 rangers that are killed every year protecting wildlife around the world. And mostly they're killed at the hands of poachers. It's a really, really devastating and sad statistic. And again, you know, Jarrad had mentioned that wildlife trafficking fuels corruption. And we also know that it spreads disease and poses risks, especially for zoonotic disease emergence and spread. And we'll talk about what zoonotic diseases are in the next slide. So zoonotic diseases are those that originate in animals and jump to humans, or we like to say originate in other animals because you know, we recognize that humans are animals as well. And this can happen anytime there's direct contact between humans and wildlife. So these interactions can occur with animals in markets, wildlife as exotic pets through consumption as food, and wildlife trafficking or encroachment of people into wildlife habitat. It's also important to note that the majority of emerging infectious diseases are actually zoonotic, including COVID-19, AIDS, Ebola, swine flu, SARS, malaria. And the majority of zoonotic diseases actually come from wildlife as opposed to, originating in domesticated animals. So this slide just shows sort of an overview of some of the worst epidemics in history. We liked this because, it's a great schematic showing the different animals, wildlife, especially where these diseases emerged. But at the same time, we recognize that it's a very out-of-date slide. If you look at the COVID-19 figure, this is from April 2020. So if we're going to give a more current figure for COVID-19, we looked it up earlier this week, and there have been about 650 million cases of COVID-19 globally, and around 6.65 million deaths thus far. So what is the State Department's role in combating wildlife trafficking? We have over 200 embassies around the world. Most of them have a dedicated environment officer or a team that will be specifically focusing on environmental issues, including wildlife issues. And so we have folks in basically every country where we have an embassy who will be working with the host country on these issues. The US Congress has provided well over $100 million a year for combating wildlife trafficking globally. And this is typically split between the State Department and USAID. And in recent years, it's been, much closer to about 130 million, 125 million. So that's why we just say well over 100 million. And we recognize the State Department is really part of a whole of government approach to combating wildlife trafficking with our Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking, which is co-chaired by the Department of State, Department of Interior, Department of Justice, and our sort of honorary co-chair of USAID. And together as a whole of government approach, we also use our national strategy for combating wildlife trafficking to implement, which has 3 pillars. And so I'll go sort of into those pillars now. So the first is strengthening enforcement globally. So we work to strengthen coordination and enforcement efforts, working with law enforcement and intelligence organizations and agencies within the US government. So big ones are the Fish and Wildlife Service, which sits in the Department of the Interior, the Department of Homeland Security, Department of Justice, and as well as with our sister bureau, the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. They have a specific team that works on combating wildlife trafficking globally. We build capacity of other governments to combat wildlife trafficking through training, providing equipment, and really providing technical assistance, advising on how governments can strengthen their laws on wildlife trafficking. We support community-based conservation and protected area management as well. And we really work to target corruption within governments. Sometimes, as Jarrad mentioned earlier, some high-level government officials will have incentives to make money off of allowing wildlife trafficking to happen, and we try to really expose that and work to target corruption within governments. The other last bullet is on our visa ineligibility program for wildlife and timber traffickers. This basically means, if you're a known or suspected wildlife or timber trafficker, we can put you on a list that basically will create a flag when, if you apply for a visa to come to the United States, you can be rejected for a visa. And this basically sends a strong message that, sorry about that. This basically sends a strong message that, the United States does not condone wildlife or timber trafficking and will also not be used as, a transit point or any way to facilitate the actions of wildlife and timber traffickers. So our last or another pillar is demand reduction. So we work on outreach and public awareness on the impacts of wildlife trafficking through our public diplomacy programs. We have a program basically with working to reduce demand for the use of protected and endangered species in traditional medicine. That's a big area of focus, as Jarrad pointed out before. And we generally promote education and engagement with partner organizations, local NGOs. We engage with the private sector and civil society, including, U.S. traditional medicine practitioners to develop new industry standards. We really rely a lot also on NGOs around the world and local organizations to tell us what's going on, so that we know, what the situation is on the ground and what are the most important things for specific local areas. And of course, our approach is data-driven. So all of our interventions rely on the examination of wildlife trafficking patterns and data. So lastly, our third pillar is expanding international cooperation. So we work to strengthen implementation of international agreements like CITES, as Jarrad mentioned before. We work to build effective partnerships with governments, intergovernmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, local communities, and the private sector. This gets back to the point I made on the previous slide about, relying on all the eyes and ears to help us improve our interventions. We develop and implement innovative and effective approaches to combating wildlife trafficking, always, again, looking at the data, telling us what's working, what's not working, so that we can change our approaches accordingly. And yeah, we encourage governments to take on stronger commitments to combat wildlife trafficking and to engage in multilateral forums and partnerships, such as the nascent Nature Crime Alliance. So what can you do? You can develop your knowledge and interest in conservation and combating wildlife trafficking, do some independent research, become informed, engage in conservation activities, be informed, particularly, before buying pets. We're getting into the holiday season, and it's good to just know, the exotic species around, what does it really mean, participating in like, is that a legitimate supply chain that you're entering in? Be mindful when purchasing products on social media and internet platforms. A lot of wildlife trafficking happens over the internet, so that's always a good thing to keep in mind. And then we've just put a few resources here as well that folks can take a look at, as well as, if you have any questions or would like more information, there's our email again, also at the bottom of the screen. So I guess this leads into our Q&A section. So I'll hand it back over. Thank you.
I'm stopping the share there, and or maybe I can do that. There we go. Thank you so much. I mean, it is an incredibly, your discussion was an incredibly clear and concise discussion of an issue that, many of us know about, but you usually don't get past the kind of anecdotal bit of, and so that the depth is much appreciated. And I'm going to remind viewers that this video will be on YouTube. So those links that Annie shared in the last slide, if you want to go more deeply into the issue, please have a look at that. Absolutely fascinating depth. Now, we don't have a lot of time, but I would like to ask one question to you both. You didn't mention this, but if you wouldn't mind going into a little bit more depth on the supply side, or the what am I saying? You mentioned the drivers. Sorry, let me get to this. We hear oftentimes that those communities and those people who are providing this supply, the actual hunters or those who are gathering the plants, maybe suffering in situations of chronic poverty and underdevelopment. Is that so? And if so, what is done to mitigate that?
Thanks. That's a great question, and maybe I'll take a stab, and then Annie can add some more if need be. I think that is exactly correct. I think a lot of this trade does stem out of desperation, out of people that are trying to meet the needs of their family, be that income to pay for their children's education, be that out of the need to provide food for their families. One of the things that the US government does, and this is through programming, particularly with the USAID, is programs that develop alternative livelihoods and resiliency within communities. So there are many programs where the US government works with communities to provide smallholder livestock programs and things like that. Guinea pigs in the DRC, in communities that border national parks, so that those families and communities have an alternative source of food and perhaps agricultural production that would then sort of dissuade them from the need to go out into wild areas to hunt wildlife and things like that. So there's a lot of money invested in alternative livelihoods for these communities that I guess in some cases is very targeted to address wildlife trafficking, and in other cases is not necessarily targeted at wildlife trafficking, but certainly helps and overlaps with addressing that problem. Hope that. Annie, do you have anything else?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jarrad. I think the points that you made are exactly right. I would point to our colleagues at USAID for that question to provide much more details. But I think also a really important thing to recognize is that the people who are desperate, they're oftentimes being exploited by larger, we recognize that wildlife trafficking is a form of organized crime. There are people at the bottom and there are people at the top. And the people at the top don't care about the people at the bottom at all. Maybe the low-level poachers are making more money, certainly than they could in other areas, but it's much more dangerous. And, they're not seeing the full value of the wildlife that they are catching. That money is going to someone who is very comfortable, and not in the same harm's way. So I would just highlight that as well, that there's a lot of exploitation too of people's circumstances.
Go ahead with many, many more questions on this fascinating topic. We're going to have to close off to make sure we can fit this into a class period. I do want to say from our side here in Montana, this issue is something that really connects us all, no matter where you are in the state. Montanans have a big interest in clean air, clean water, clean land, and biodiversity. And so whether you're a farmer or a rancher or a hunter or a fisher, maybe you're a hiker or you like to float the river or raft, or maybe you just enjoy nature in our great national parks. all of us here in Montana can really understand, and what you've said really resonates with us. So thanks for bringing that a little bit closer to home. Let me also quickly thank some of our many sponsors for Academic World Quest at the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, QFI, and Longview Foundation, and many, many more who help us bring this and other programs to schools and communities across Montana. Please remember, Academic World Quest students, that this and other preparation videos are on our YouTube channel. Check them out. Get ready. Really looking forward to seeing you all at University of Montana in March. Finally, let me thank once again the U.S. Department of State and our friends there, Jared and Annie. Thank you both so much for joining.